first question you may be asking yourself is, why calibrate? What's the purpose of this? The main reason that you need to calibrate with your group is to make sure that a paper that is scored in your classroom and receives a passing score is the same as the paper that's scored in my classroom receiving a passing score. The second reason that it's absolutely essential that we remain consistent is that these papers, these work samples, reading and writing work samples, are used to help students meet the essential skills requirement for graduation. Now that you understand the importance of calibration, let's review the steps that you need to take. The first thing I wanted to tell you about is the amount of time that it takes to calibrate. You can expect that it's going to take approximately an hour of calibration before you dig into grading your own student work. The first part is really looking at your group logistics. You may have a large group or a small group, but whichever size group you have, you're going to have to make some decisions about how you're going to discuss things in that group. The second step is looking at the scoring guide and reviewing the scoring guide trait by trait, whether it's reading or writing scoring that you're doing. The next thing you'll do is to calibrate using some pre-scored work samples that have been given to us from the Department of Education. Next, you will score your own work samples. Step number 1 is to review the scoring guide language for each trait while you're highlighting the key words. I suggest that you start by looking at the language for each individual trait. So for reading, it would be demonstrating understanding, develop an interpretation, and analyzing text. For writing, it would be ideas and content, organization, sentence fluency, etc. So after you've reviewed the description for each trait, then focus on the language for each individual score, scores ranging from 1 to 6. I suggest that you start by looking at the language for a 4 and then move up and down on the scoring guide. My logic for that is that you really want to look at what meets in that category. And then once you determine what meets, you could move either up or down depending on the description that fits. Do the first part of this activity silently and individually, and then you may discuss with a partner or group according to your group protocols. A key point to discuss is what is the difference between the trait of 3 and 4, and what are the differences between a 4 and 5. Step number 2 is to calibrate using pre-scored work samples provided by the Oregon Department of Education. The first sample in your packet will be a passing score, a paper or a reading work sample that has received all 4s. So what you'll do is you will go ahead and you'll read the paper through, knowing that it has received 4, and using your scoring guide, make sure that you understand the rationale. Why did this paper earn all 4s? If you don't understand it, with these papers, commentary provided by the Department of Education will explain why each of the scores were allotted as they were. Once you've looked at that sample paper of a 4, then you'll move on to looking at several other papers in the packet, and you will determine the scores on your own. Once all the scoring has been done individually, you can compare your scores with the commentary provided by the state and see how your scores compare. At that point, you can discuss with a partner how your scores match or don't match the state scores. The overall understanding is that if your scores are 1 point off, higher or lower, that you're still within range. But if you're significantly higher or lower, you really need to adjust your thinking to make sure that you try to match the state scoring scores that have been predetermined. So now you've reviewed the scoring guide language, you understand all the words on there and what makes a 4, what makes a 6, what makes a 2. So you're confident about your scoring guide understanding. You've looked at some sample papers and you know that you're in sync with what the ODE has determined is a passing score for each of these papers. So you know what a 4 looks like. Now it's time to apply all of this to your own student work. What I suggest you do in this process is that you sit down with all of your papers, your work samples or your writing samples, and you silently score the first 2 to 3 papers and you pass them to another person to be double scored. After those first 2 to 3 papers have been double scored, stop and discuss your scoring. Are your paper scores matching up within the group? If they're not, you need to go back to the scoring guide and see which scores reflect the scoring guide language most accurately, and make sure that within your group that you've established consistency. After those first papers have been double scored, papers don't all have to be double scored, but you may decide that occasionally you have a paper that you're confused about or you're really not sure where you fall on that, and then in that case you would want to go back and have a second person double score to make sure that your group is still in sync. Whenever there are questions about what score a paper should receive, always go back to that scoring guide language and make sure that you're using that language as the basis of determining the final score. So what now? Calibration should be part of your general practice. The district requires that you attend 1 reading calibration and 1 writing calibration per year. But anytime that you sit down to score student papers with your PLC or individually, the calibration process should be part of your practice. It doesn't always have to be as extensive as this 1-hour process that we just went through, but simply looking at least 1 passing work sample that receives a 4 while having your scoring guide out can make sure that your group is in sync. Additionally, if you're scoring work samples on your own, having those sample papers or revisiting the state website to look at some of the passing papers, that receive some that pass and some that receive other scores, can help you stay in tune with that scoring guide and make sure. If you'd like more materials, you could visit the state website. They have a ton of student-scored work, both reading work samples and writing work samples, or you could visit with your department head in your building.